Welcome to Creepy Whispers. I'm Jack Thompson, and here we'll explore stories that will send chills down your spine. Get ready to dive into the unknown, where each whisper hides a secret. First story: moving to that suburban house seemed the perfect opportunity for our family. My husband, our two kids, and I had been looking for a larger place for months, but prices were always out of our budget. When the realtor showed us that old house with a big yard at a price we could afford, we didn't think twice. Little did we know that decision would change our lives forever. We moved in on a sunny spring Friday. I remember the smell of fresh paint mixed with the aroma of garden flowers. The kids were ecstatic, running around, choosing their rooms and making plans for the treehouse we promised to build. That night, exhausted but happy, we went to bed early. It was during that first night that things started to get strange. I woke up in the middle of the night to a strange noise. At first, I thought it was just the wind or the new house creaking, but something felt different. I sat up in bed and listened. That's when I heard it. Whispers very low, as if someone was talking behind our bedroom wall. I poked my husband, but he just mumbled and turned over. The next day, I tried to convince myself it was just a dream or my imagination playing tricks. But that sense of normalcy didn't last long. During breakfast, my youngest daughter, only 6 years old, innocently asked, "Mommy, who were those people whispering in my room last night?" I felt a chill run down my spine. We exchanged worried looks, knowing our daughter had never been one to make up stories. In the days that followed, we tried to stay calm and follow our normal routine. But it was impossible to ignore the strange events that began to happen more frequently. Objects mysteriously changed places. I'd put the car keys on the entrance table and minutes later find them on the living room shelf. The TV remote would vanish from the couch and appear inside the fridge. The whispering voices became more frequent, especially at night. Our children started having trouble sleeping, saying they heard people talking in the walls. We tried to calm them down, saying it was just their imagination, but deep down, we knew something wasn't right. One night, I decided to stay awake to try to understand what was happening. The situation at home became increasingly tense. My husband, who initially doubted our experiences, started to become visibly disturbed. One morning, he woke me up with wide eyes, swearing he had seen a shadow moving in the hallway during the night. The children were increasingly scared and reluctant to stay alone in their rooms. We started sleeping together in the living room. We decided to investigate the history of the house, hoping to find some explanation for the strange events. We went to the local library and researched old city archives. What we discovered only increased our unease. The house had been built in the late 19th century and had several owners over the years. Many families who lived there left suddenly without explanation. As the weeks passed, the situation at home became unbearable. The whispers in the walls were almost constant, day and night. Objects not only changed places, but sometimes levitated before our eyes. One night, I woke up to the sound of heavy footsteps upstairs, as if someone was pacing back and forth. The problem was, we didn't have an upper floor, just a small attic. At that point, we decided to ask for help. We contacted a local group of paranormal investigators, even though we felt a bit ridiculous doing so. To our surprise, they took our story seriously and agreed to come to the house. On the day of the investigation, they arrived with various strange equipment: EMF detectors, infrared cameras, audio recorders. The results of the paranormal investigation only increased our anguish. The group showed us photos with luminous orbs floating through the rooms and even the silhouette of a human figure in the hallway, exactly where my husband had seen the moving shadow. That same night, we decided we couldn't stay there any longer. We hurriedly packed our bags, throwing our things in the car. We spent the following weeks at my parents' house, trying to process everything that had happened and decide what to do next. It was difficult to explain the situation to friends and family without sounding completely crazy. Some thought we were exaggerating. Others suggested we seek psychological help. But we knew what we had experienced. Months passed, and gradually we tried to resume our normal life. We rented an apartment in another city, and the children started attending a new school. But the experience in the whispering house left deep marks on all of us. Sometimes I catch my husband staring fixedly at the walls of our new home, as if expecting them to start talking at any moment. We never went back to that place. We heard from acquaintances that the house was empty for a while, with rumors circulating in the neighborhood about the reasons for our sudden departure. Eventually, a new family moved in there. Sometimes I find myself thinking about them, wondering if they're hearing the same whispers, if objects are still moving on their own. Second story, the apartment 13B seemed like the perfect solution to my financial problems when I started college. Like many other university students, I was on a tight budget and needed to find a cheap place to live in the capital. The ad for that apartment in an old building downtown caught my attention immediately. The price was so good, it seemed impossible, but I decided to take a chance and went to see the property. The first few weeks went by normally. My routine was simple. I went to college in the morning, spent the whole day there, and only came back at night to study and sleep. The apartment was quiet, which was great for my study routine. But then, about a month after moving in, I started to notice something strange. One day, I came home and noticed that the living room armchair was at a different angle than I had left it. At first, I tried to rationalize these changes. Maybe I was so tired that I didn't remember moving things. Or perhaps the old building had some structural problem that made objects move on their own. But the more I tried to find logical explanations, the more disturbing the occurrences became. One night, after a long day of classes, I came home and found all the paintings in the living room turned to face the wall. I decided to investigate. I started paying more attention to everything around me, photographing the position of objects before leaving and comparing when I returned. The changes were subtle, but undeniable. One day, the bedroom curtain was partially open, when I was sure I had closed it. On another, I found my laptop open on the living room table, although I had left it stored in my backpack. Fear and anxiety began to affect my performance in college. I could barely concentrate in class, always thinking about what might be happening in the apartment while I was away. My colleagues noticed my strange behavior and asked if everything was okay, but how could I explain something I didn't even understand myself? One afternoon, after a particularly difficult test, I decided to go home early. That night was the longest of my life. I went back to the apartment and with trembling hands rearranged the furniture. Every noise, every shadow made me jump. I didn't want to believe in the supernatural, but the neighbor's words echoed in my mind. I decided to stay awake all night, determined to catch whatever was playing tricks on me. I sat in the living room armchair, facing the door, with all the lights on. The next morning, exhausted and still in shock, I decided I couldn't stay in that place any longer. I went up to the apartment, determined to get my things and leave as quickly as possible. But when I opened the door, I was dumbfounded. Everything was exactly as I had left it before moving in. The furniture was in its original places. There was no sign of the mess from the night before. Confused and scared, I started frantically packing my things. As I did so, I realized that some of my belongings had disappeared. Photos, books, even some clothes. In their place, I found objects that weren't mine: an old music box, an antique wall clock, clothes in outdated styles. It was as if the apartment had exchanged parts of my life for fragments of other eras. With trembling hands, I finished gathering what I could of my things. I didn't bother taking the strange objects that had appeared. I left them where they were. When I was about to leave, I heard a sound coming from the wall. It was as if someone was scratching from inside it. I froze in place, my heart beating so hard it felt like it was going to jump out of my mouth. I ran down the stairs, almost tripping on the steps. When I reached the ground floor, the caretaker was there, with that same strange look from the first day. He didn't seem surprised to see me in that state. He just held out his hand, asking for the keys. I handed them over without saying a word and left the building as fast as I could. As I walked away, I looked back one last time. In the window of 13B, I saw a silhouette watching. Third story, my grandfather's inheritance came with a price I could never have imagined. A few weeks ago, I finally decided to tackle the task of restoring his old house, a place filled with childhood memories. At first, it seemed like a simple mission: clean, organize, and give new life to that old building. I was excited about the idea of transforming the space, little knowing that this decision would lead me to question everything I believed to be real or imaginary. That Saturday morning, I woke up early, determined to start with the most challenging room, the basement. I went down the creaky stairs with a flashlight in hand, smelling the mold and dust that permeated the air. As my eyes adjusted to the dim light, I began to make out the shapes of furniture covered with dusty sheets and boxes piled in the corners. I took a deep breath and started working, removing the covers and opening the boxes one by one. That's when I noticed something strange. Every time I turned to grab another box, I had the impression that the objects I had just arranged had moved slightly. At first, I tried to ignore this strange feeling. After all, I was tired, and the basement was poorly lit. But as the day went on, it became increasingly difficult to explain what was happening. Objects that I was sure I had placed in one spot appeared in another when I looked back. An old wall clock that I swore I had left on top of a dresser was now on the floor, its glass cracked as if it had fallen. The most disturbing was my grandfather's old teddy bear, which seemed to change position every time I looked away. One moment it was sitting, the next lying on its side, as if someone had moved it. I decided to take a break for lunch and clear my mind. I went upstairs, feeling a chill down my spine as if someone was watching me. I quickly prepared a sandwich in the kitchen and sat down at the dining room table, trying to rationalize what was happening. That's when I heard it. A soft sound, almost imperceptible at first, but which became clearer. Footsteps on the floor above. I froze, the sandwich halfway to my mouth. I was alone in the house. I was sure of it. I had locked all the doors when I arrived in the morning. The footsteps continued, slow and deliberate, as if someone was calmly walking down the hallway on the second floor. My heart raced. I sat paralyzed in the chair, listening intently to each step echoing above me. I tried to convince myself that it was just the old house creaking, or maybe an animal that had entered through the attic. But I couldn't deny the constant human rhythm of those steps. Gathering all the courage I could, I got up and walked to the foot of the stairs. "Hello," I called out with a trembling voice. The silence that followed was deafening. The footsteps stopped immediately. I waited, breathing heavily, for any sound or movement. Nothing. After a few minutes that seemed like an eternity, I decided to go up and check. With shaky legs, I slowly climbed each step, my heart pounding in my chest. When I reached the second floor hallway, I saw nothing out of place. The bedroom doors were closed, exactly as I had left them in the morning. I opened each one, thoroughly inspecting the rooms. There was no sign of intruders, no open windows, nothing that could explain the sounds I heard. I was about to convince myself that I had imagined it all when I noticed something strange in my grandfather's old room. The old chest at the foot of the bed was open. I'm absolutely sure I left it closed the last time I was there. I cautiously approached and looked inside. To my astonishment, the items seemed to have been rummaged through, as if someone had been looking for something there. With trembling hands, I began to examine the contents of the chest. There were old photos, yellowed letters, and some of my grandfather's personal belongings. As I rummaged through these items, I found something I had never seen before, a small leather-bound diary hidden at the bottom. I hesitated for a moment, feeling like I was invading my grandfather's privacy, even though he was no longer here. But curiosity was stronger. I opened the diary and began to read. The first pages were quite ordinary, reporting his daily life. However, as I progressed in reading, the entries became stranger and more disturbing. My grandfather wrote about experiences similar to what I was having. He mentioned objects that moved on their own, inexplicable sounds, and a constant feeling of being watched. The most intriguing thing was that it all started after he inherited this same house from his own grandfather. The last pages of the diary were full of crazy theories about dimensional portals and entities from beyond. I was so absorbed in reading that I didn't notice the time passing. When I finally looked up from the diary, I noticed that the room was significantly darker. The sun was setting, and a feeling of discomfort began to grow inside me. I decided it was time to leave that room. I put the diary back in the chest and headed for the door. That's when I felt it, a sudden drop in temperature, as if all the heat had been sucked out of the environment. My breath formed small clouds of vapor in the air. I tried to open the door, but it wouldn't move. I turned the knob harder, pushed with my shoulder, but nothing worked. It was locked. Panic began to take over me. How was this possible? I hadn't locked the door, nor was there any way to lock it from the outside. I screamed for help, even knowing there was no one to hear me. It was at that moment that I heard it again. The footsteps. This time, they weren't coming from upstairs, but from the hallway on the other side of the door. Slow, heavy, approaching. My heart felt like it was going to jump out of my mouth. I held my breath, waiting. The footsteps stopped right in front of the bedroom door. There was a pause that seemed to last an eternity. Then, the doorknob began to turn slowly. I backed up until I hit the opposite wall, my eyes fixed on the door. It began to open slowly, creaking on its hinges. The darkness of the corridor seemed denser, deeper than should be possible. And then, I saw something moving in that darkness, a shape I couldn't clearly distinguish. My whole body was shaking, unable to move as that dark form began to enter the room. I couldn't make out features or details. It was as if the shadow itself was coming to life. I closed my eyes tightly, praying that all of this was just a nightmare. When I opened them again, the figure had disappeared. The door was wide open, showing only the empty, dark corridor. Without thinking twice, I ran out of the room, stumbling down the stairs, desperate to get out of that house. When I reached the front door, I struggled with the lock for a few seconds that seemed like an eternity. I finally managed to open it and threw myself outside, breathing in the fresh night air as if it were the first time. I ran to my car, got in, and locked the doors, my hands shaking so much I could barely hold the keys. It was only then, sitting there with my heart still beating frantically, that I noticed something strange. The sky was clear, the sun still high. I looked at the car clock. It was 2 in the afternoon. How was this possible? I had spent hours in that room, had seen the sunset. I looked back at the house, confused and scared. Everything looked normal, quiet, as if nothing had happened. I sat there in the car for a long time, trying to process what had happened. Part of me wanted to leave and never come back, but another part was curious, wanting to understand. After a few minutes, I gathered the courage to return to the house. With hesitant steps, I entered again. Everything was exactly as I had left it before the incident in my grandfather's room. I slowly climbed the stairs, each step making my heart race. The room was normal, the door open, the chest closed. I opened it again, looking for the diary, but it was no longer there. I searched the entire room, all the rooms in the house, but the diary had simply disappeared. Since that day, I have been returning to the house regularly, determined to discover what really happened. Things are still strange, objects still move when I'm not looking. Sometimes I hear inexplicable sounds. But I've never had such an intense experience again. I researched the history of the house, talked to old neighbors, even consulted a medium, but no one could give me satisfactory answers. I continued to restore the house, but now with an eye always alert to anything out of the ordinary. I don't know if I'll ever understand what happened that afternoon, or if it was all a figment of my imagination. But one thing is certain, I will never look at that house the same way again. And whenever I'm there, I can't shake the feeling that I'm being watched, that there's something or someone waiting to reveal itself again.